Good evening. I'm Andrew Natsios, the director of the Scowcroft Institute of International Affairs at the Bush School of Government at Texas A&M University. Welcome to our program this evening. Before I introduce our guest, the Bush School ambassador is going to pass out cards for you to write your... Liliana, why don't you come and sit down and I'll introduce you and then... and you write your cards down, pass them to the end of the row, and they'll pick up the cards. I will go through them because there are sometimes repeated questions, and we don't want to ask the same question 3 times. So I will go through them as I converse with Ambassador Ayalde after she gives her talk. So she's going to speak first, then we'll sit down and answer questions. So Ambassador Ayalde retired from the U.S. Foreign Service following a very distinguished 38-year career. She held positions at the Department of State, the United States Agency for International Development, and the Department of Defense, which I did not know about until you told me today. So you need to talk a little bit about that. That's quite fascinating, actually. Ambassador Ayalde served as the civilian deputy to the commander and foreign policy advisor at the United States Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM, in Miami until September of 2019, when she was appointed as the U.S. ambassador to the Federal Republic of Brazil, which is what she's going to talk about this evening, between 2013 and 2016. Prior to that, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs in the Department of State. She also served as the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean Bureau in AID, and following her assignment as the U.S. Mission Director in Colombia. Colombia was the largest USAID mission. It was part of Plan Colombia, and Liliana it's very difficult to be revered in AID and the State Department and the Defense Department simultaneously. In fact, it almost never happens. But Ambassador Ayalde was in that category. She also served as the mission director she was a U.S. ambassador, in Paraguay, but I met her when she was mission director in Bolivia. The U.S. mission director means you're the head of the USAID program in a particular country. Ambassador Ayalde is currently a senior advisor for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the major think tanks in Washington, CSIS, and serves on the board of the Wilson Center's Latin America program, the National Endowment for Democracy, and IRX, a nonprofit organization focused on development and governance and education. I could go through all of the awards she's gotten, but we'll be here all night. She's got the highest awards there are in state AID and DOD. And so me saying that she's revered is not just me using rhetoric, it's reflected in the highest civilian award you can get in those 3 departments. So as if you don't know, USAID is our foreign aid program. The reason I invited Liliana, I knew she would come because she and I are good friends, but I was the USAID Mission Director under Bush 43, President Bush W. And I was also at AID under Bush 41, so at a lower level. She received her bachelor's degree in international studies at American University in Washington, D.C., and her master's in public health from Tulane University. She's fluent in Spanish and Portuguese, and she has a working knowledge of French. I might add that she was born in Colombia. So we have a number of very senior officers, and I'm telling this to some of my students who are dual citizens, whether they...
Actually, I was born here, but of Colombian parents.
Oh, that's what it was, okay. Because you have no accent at all. I was wondering, how did you arrange that? But we have many officers actually were born in other countries, became American citizens, joined the Foreign Service, and they're wonderful mission directors because they could understand cultures in other societies. But it's my honor to introduce one of the role models in AID for young men and young women, but particularly for young women in AID, and they would tell me that. I said, who is your role model in the agency? He said, Liliana Ayalde is our role model. So it's an honor to have you here. Thank you. She's going to talk about Brazil, but also about maybe the Foreign Service and whatever you want to talk about, and then we'll answer questions. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Andrew, for that very gracious introduction, and more so for the invitation to come here. It's I haven't been here too long, but I've already seen just the beauty of this campus, and so many things going on. It makes me want to come back and spend more time with you. When I first got this invitation, I had to remember our time in Bolivia, and as I just recalled how many emblematic programs that we had there cooperating with Bolivia. At the time, it was one of our largest development assistance programs in the hemisphere, and the experiences with the private sector and healthcare and organizations like ProSalud that are still active, sustainable, interesting models, and microfinance. A lot of the experiences there led to others globally, and of course a lot of work with decentralization and alternative development, which was alternatives to small farmers to grow other things than coca. And so, I mean, it was an amazing program and a great opportunity to showcase what USAID does in countries together with the partners to try to move countries from the lower income indicators to a better economic standing. But I've been asked today to talk about Brazil. And when I first heard the invitation of coming and talking about Brazil, anything that is Brazil, I want to go and talk, because I feel that venues like this and forums like this really allows us to learn more about a country that is not well understood and appreciated. And so the more we talk and discuss and deepen our knowledge, I think it's important, because I think Brazil matters. What happens in Brazil matters not only to Brazil domestically, it matters to the region, to the neighbors, and in certain cases it matters on global challenges and global issues. It is one of the largest economies and largest democracies in the hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere. And so I think that it does carry important implications, and not only on obvious things such as climate change because of the Amazon, the vastness of the Amazon there, but it is a country of 216 million plus people, and that carries with it a tremendous amount. It's attractive in terms of purchasing power and just the ability to influence on a number of different issues. And something that's not always appreciated, the United States and Brazil are two of the largest food exporters and food producers in the world. So the responsibility on certain issues such as food security, and I know I'm sort of in an environment of Aggies, it's an important sector to be in. So I just wanted to highlight that it does matter, and the more we know about Brazil, the better. The country has gone through a very controversial and consequential election. The electoral period was characterized by a lot of misinformation, fake news, allegations, accusations, and even at times sporadic violence. And for those who followed it closely, you could see how the intensity of the campaigns played out heavily through social media. And by the way, Brazil is a huge user of social media platforms of all sorts. And so this became a big venue for for carrying out the electoral process that really deepened the division in and around the country. So following the second round of elections, which were held October 30th, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, the former president, who had been former president twice in 2 previous terms in 2003 and 2002 through 2007, and again 2007 through 2011, won the election. And he actually had left his second term and with a very high popularity rate of about 80%. So he was declared president for the third time, winning over the incumbent president. And I've stressed the incumbent because I think this is something I'm seeing we are all seeing in the hemisphere, that there's this anti-incumbent feeling in general. But in this case, it was against President Jair Bolsonaro. And this was the first time it had happened in the case of Brazil. But what I wanted to highlight, I think, in this election is that the margin of winning was very, very narrow. And he was inaugurated January 1st, which is a horrible date for an inauguration. That's been changed in the Constitution, so next time it will be a different date. But and at the same, the inauguration was done in the absence of President Bolsonaro, who had come to the United States. And then days later, January 8th, the Brazilian Congress, the presidential palace, and the Supreme Court were attacked by thousands of pro-Bolsonaro rioters aiming to oust Lula. There were calls for fraudulent elections had been brewing for a long time, though there was no evidence of that. And so the insurrection, there were lots of parallels of our own January 6th experience. The insurrection tested the strength of the Brazilian democracy and its institutions. It was this insurrection in Brasilia and around, and there were protests in other cities around the country. It was meant to challenge the result of the election and to threaten democracy. But despite the chaos, the crisis, the physical destruction, the violence, the democratic institutions did their part, and the Brazilian democracy survived. Many people were arrested, and investigations of those who either financed or had a role in facilitating the insurrection, those investigations are currently ongoing. It's going to be challenging to the followers of Bolsonaro to look for a constructive role in Congress where these disagreements can be, and these disputes can be managed in an institutional way. But I'm hopeful that the institutions there are strong enough to be able to do it. But I think that to understand what Brazil is confronted with today, it's important to kind of dig in a little bit further on what the results of the elections imply and what implications it means. And so I'm going to highlight a couple of characteristics of what we find the country in today that should influence the ability of President Lula to govern successfully and to be able to deliver on the many promises during the electoral campaign. For one, Brazil is a much more conservative and polarized society. Certainly than what I expected. I lived there in 2 occasions, once as a child, and that's where I first picked up Portuguese, and of course as ambassador from 2013 to 2000. I left in January 2017. And it's definitely much more divided And it's divided between those who follow, let's say, a more Lula's vision, a more leftist-oriented vision, and those that voted for Bolsonaro, more a vision more of the right. Two very different visions of the country, and this has deep implications on the country's psyche, and it's a country that, to my surprise, has become much more conservative. The role of the evangelical church, not only in politics but overall, is much more evident than certainly when I lived and worked there. And these are realities that play heavily, not only in the elections, but moving forward, and how Lula and his administration decides to move forward with his agenda. In his inaugural speech, he talked about unity and governing for all Brazilians, but you have to recognize that he inherited a very divided country, and he needs to keep this in mind because he is from the Workers' Party, the PT, and he's got radical roots, and he will probably be pressured into gravitating into decisions or approaches that will be more left-oriented. Yet the country is not half the country is, including Congress, is in civil society and the private sector, will require a more moderate approach. Second, I think that he is inheriting a country, unlike his first and second terms, a country where the economy is not as healthy as he had before because of the boom in the commodity prices in the robust economies of the past, where he was able to fund and finance a number of social programs such as Bolsa Familia and others that were emblematic for his administration and that allowed some of those that were under the poverty level to move up and into the middle class, into the lower middle class. And these were huge social programs, but the economy was different then, and that's not the case today. Third, there is the war in Ukraine, which has impacted, which is with its impacts on fuel, on food security, and this has impacted globally, but also in particular, Brazil has relied on fertilizers coming from Russia for its very important agricultural sector. So this geopolitical reality is going to be challenging as he tries to maintain what is important, a critical input for productivity and for a very strong sector, which is the agricultural sector. And at the same time, there is this war going on. He also, fourthly, I would say, inherits the impacts of a post-COVID country. Brazil, with the United States, were at the top of the list of those that had most of the deaths. The numbers of deaths were very high as a result of COVID, and certainly, well, in the case of Brazil, I think it was close to 700,000 people died as a result, and the impact of that, is something that he will have to deal with and accommodate and address. Fifth, I would say Congress, his Congress, the Brazilian Congress, is very different from the one he was able to work with before, is far much more conservative than before, and despite him being he's very politically savvy, He's going to have to align himself with different factions and build on that. And in a country that, again, is sort of divided, the north is more Lula, and the south is more representative of, or being backed up by the Bolsonaristas, or more conservative governors and therefore senators and representatives. So all of this, these are implications for the scenario that we see today in Brazil, which I believe will have to drive Lula to being a much more moderate than he was in the past. Despite maybe the orientations of the PT party. And he will have to negotiate and get broader support from members of his coalition and navigate skillfully the Congress. And he is a political animal, so a very savvy political operator. So I have no question that he will do it, but this is far more complicated than in the past. And I think he recognized early on that the country was different by designating his vice president as Gerardo Alckmin, who Alckmin, his vice president, actually ran against him in one of his in the 2006 presidential election, and he was former governor of São Paulo, which is the hub for the private sector, for the financial sector, and is sort of an economic hub, a very powerful economic hub for Brazil. And so having him as vice president, I think, was an important signal. And not only does he have him as vice president, but he's also named him as Minister of Commerce and Industrial Development. Which to me says, okay, he recognized the need to be seen differently and to send strong signals to the private sector, reassurances to the private sector that he wouldn't be as radical as he would be, and I think he will probably use the vice president and the minister in different ways than traditionally a vice president has been used. More engagement with Congress, and certainly a very aggressive engagement with the private sector. Let me turn a little bit to foreign affairs, foreign policy, and U.S.-Brazil relations. We're in 2024, Brazil and the United States will actually commemorate 200 years of diplomatic cooperation, and the cooperation has fluctuated in intensity. I was sharing with one of your student ambassadors my story of my arrival in Brazil, which was at the lowest point in history of the relationship because of the Snowden disclosures, that just really caused all political engagement to stop. So it was really a low period, according to those who study the history of the relationship. But, there have been others, and certainly there's a lot of engagement back and forth and very positive. And what I'd like to maybe put out there is the importance of gestures in diplomacy. Fortunately, for the U.S. and Brazil relations, I think there was a quick recognition of Lula's win by President Biden following the elections, and certainly an outreach by President Biden to Lula following the January 8th insurrection to express his support for democracy. Those were important gestures, and he invited Lula for an official visit to the White House last Friday. All of these are very important. It may not seem, but in diplomacy, these are important gestures. I was happy that Lula was able to come to the United States, to Washington, before he went to Russia or China, even though he already has plans to go to China in March, and Foreign Minister Lavrov is scheduled to visit Lula in April. So despite the meeting, the visit was, I think, 24 hours or less. It was extremely short. It did include the bilateral meeting with the president and some other members of Congress, But the fact that this meeting happened early on in his tenure, to me, is very significant. It sends a signal of caring about the relationship. It sends a strong signal to the private sector. Its early engagement with the United States, to me, is very important. And you can flag issues that we can talk about later on, and there will be certainly substantive follow-up after that. And you know, they did talk about the strengthening democratic institutions, jointly combating climate change, and bolstering economic development. Those are things that were part of the agenda, and no doubt will be followed up. And they commiserated over, my understanding, of course, I was not there, but commiserated over similar trajectories, and highlighted the strength of the economies, that our two democracies had been tested, and that they were resilient, and in both cases, democracy had prevailed. But with Brazil, and we have a mature relationship with Brazil, we don't always agree with everything. And I think this is something we need to recognize, that we have to have the space, and that's why this early engagement was important. But there are issues we will not agree on. And these surfaced. And just to give you an illustration, the two presidents have very different views on the war of the Ukraine. While President Biden has worked to garner support for Ukraine globally, to stand up against unprovoked invasions, Lula indicated that both Putin and Zelensky bear responsibility for the war, and even suggested brokering negotiations between the two countries. He rejected any call for support to Ukraine with ammunitions or weapons, and indicated that Brazil does not want to have any indirect role in the war. So Lula sees little value in antagonizing Russia, because it's a key supplier of the essential fertilizer for its agricultural interest. So that's one example. The other one is China. China is Brazil's #1 trading partner above the United States. You know, they're an important member of BRICS, which is a group of large developing countries, along with India and South Africa, that Lula was very played a role in constructing. The BRICS was part of his idea in his earlier terms, and you know, China is an issue that we will have between our two countries. We will not see eye to eye, I assume, although we will continue to engage in. But Lula has other issues of which we agree on, and certainly environmental diplomacy is one that is very key, and I foresee that a much more engagement will take place on this, particularly on deforestation and other different approaches to sustainable livelihoods in the forests and so forth. So I foresee that happening. And since I have my USAID experience, I have to mention that Brazil, there is a presence of USAID in Brazil, but it's not a traditional development assistance partner because of its socioeconomic indicators. Nevertheless, it's an amazing partner to explore creative models for approaching thorny global issues, of which climate change is one. And I think there's a great opportunity to be doing things together. When I was there, for instance, there was this I would say, initiative to work between our two development assistance agencies, the Brazilian cooperation agencies and USAID, to work together jointly in providing trilateral assistance, particularly in Africa or Central America. And this is an example of how Brazil likes to work cooperation, and I think that although that the intensity of that came down in the last administration, I foresee that happening again because of Lulas' interest in these kinds of initiatives. I think I'm going to stop here on talking about Brazil, because I'm interested in entertaining maybe some conversation and some questions, particularly on development and foreign affairs as a career choice. I feel tremendously privileged to have served for 39 years. I didn't think it was 39 years until it was time to leave. Every one of my assignments, and I lived in and worked in 7 different countries, served under 5 different administrations. Every one of those assignments, and each one of them was different. It was like a different job. It was very personally and professionally rewarding. And part of my reason for being here, and I know this is a learning institution, is to try to get people to think about joining the Foreign Service or getting involved in development through the nonprofit world, doing international work, and there are so many creative ways. My own trajectory was very unusual because I joined with USAID. I was a public health specialist. My master's was in public health, international public health. I started working on maternal child health programs and very quickly entered into governance and democracy building programs. And it led me to a career that went from, as Andrew mentioned, from USAID to the State Department, even to the Department of Defense. And it was just an amazing career for me, and I would certainly encourage those that have an interest in international affairs to explore. And it's not a rigid entry point. I guess it's the message I would leave is we have all sorts of disciplines in the Foreign Service, in international affairs. And I think today, and I'm a strong believer, that the issues of today are so complex that we need diversity in the way we look at the issues. So I can not only look at this as a health practitioner, I need to look at all the different angles. And because that's the reality of what we live in, these global issues that we're confronted with. So I just leave that out there as a word of encouragement to those that are, or for sons and daughters or friends and neighbors that may want to get into this. I was very happy being a public servant for serving for that many, and I would do it over again. Even the difficult times and the sacrifices on family and so forth, but even my daughters. I have two teenage daughters through the career. Of course, they're now older, and they feel so blessed that they were able to learn languages, meet different people, have friends all over the world today, and it opened their eyes to really getting a better understanding of what happens globally. So I just want to end it with that, and more of a private pitch for folks to look at foreign affairs and international development as a possible career track. Thank you.
So the ambassadors are collecting the cards now, but let me just start with a few questions if I could. I recall when Lula took over in his first term that given the more radical elements of his party that are not social democrats, they're further to the left, they're more Marxist, that he would move the country to enormous ideological conflict in particular. And the business community there was some panic in the business community. However, his fiscal policies, at least the first term, were, I think actually when he was in office, his successor got into fiscal trouble with overspending and huge deficits and all that, but he did not. And he cultivated the business community, and I wouldn't say he's pro-business, but he was not hostile to the business community. Can you talk a little bit about that? One thing he did do, which I really had trouble with, he would bring North Koreans. I mean, the North Korean government is one of the most abusive governments in the world. It's more repressive than Nazi Germany, and I'm not exaggerating. They have prison camps up in the Northeast. I know a lot about North Korea. And he would invite them to conferences and meetings, and I never understood that. And the only explanation I had for it is the radical elements within his party. He was pandering to them in a symbolic way that didn't involve changing Brazilian domestic policy. What explanation could there be? And of course he cultivated Castro, which I'm not a fan of Castro, but
right, yeah, no, and Venezuela.
Yes, and Venezuela and Chavez.
And in fact, he has a former foreign affairs, Minister of Foreign Affairs from that time,
yeah,
that is currently his senior advisor on international affairs.
What's his name?
Celso Almorín.
Was he ambassador to the United States?
No.
There was an ambassador who later became foreign minister. No, it was his successor. He became foreign minister under his successor.
Right, and the ambassador today was ambassador to the United States.
Ah, okay. So
Mauro Vieira. Yeah, I think we will continue to see that, and a lot of things that will just shock us and say, ugh, why? But at the end of the day, it's the actions, and I think with the business sector, that's what it was important. It's not easy to do business in Brazil, regardless of,
right,
who's in power. It's a country that has very onerous tax codes, and the logistics are complicated. The labor code is complicated, so doing business there is very complicated. And so, but you want to send the signals of confidence, and sometimes you see these things and you go, for instance, I was hoping that he would name a minister of finance that brought an aura of confidence, and it was a PT person that not necessarily, I don't think, generated that message. But I don't think he will stop with those messages that will just shock you. But at the end of the day, it's looking for that space where we can actually work and yes, like the North Korea, and it's like with Russia right now, and
Russia, I understand. I don't agree with it, but I understand why they're doing, because without fertilizer, their economy, their agricultural economy, will be devastated. So I can understand the neutrality, but the North Korea thing, North Korea offers absolutely nothing
yes.
to Brazil.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, but I think we're gonna, maybe he's gonna be we'll moderate it a little bit more, and that's why we need the space to be able to have these conversations of trying to ask these questions continuously.
Now, could you, before I answer the questions, could you explain this really very innovative program? At first I was skeptical of it, but it had a really salutary effect on class mobility, where people were, if they sent their kids to school, they got their kids immunized and a few other conditions, they would get a monthly
stipend.
Could you go through how that worked? And it was very expensive.
Yeah, very expensive, but they did get a lot of commitments from the World Bank and others and the IDB to try to make sure that it was appropriately managed, because obviously it entailed a very thorough census and to avoid abuse. But yes, the families would get a certain stipend depending on meeting a number of criteria, including going to school and so forth. And that allowed about 35 million people to move from poverty up to the middle class. I believe some of those have gone back down. Now, was that program sustainable? That's a big question, because it was at huge costs. But it was a program that was studied deeply by many.
Mexico tried to do something
similar, and with not as much success. But in Brazil, it seems to have succeeded. And
Bolsonaro did not end it, did he?
So interestingly enough, initially he did, but then during the campaign, he started something that was called differently. I forget what the name was, but he started a stipend program as well.
Interesting.
And he did, actually, there was, when you looked at the polls in the northern region, which is the poorest area of Brazil, it did impact on his popularity. But he tried to do something that had the same stipend kind of thing. Very expensive, and of course, the money really wasn't there for long term.
When I was President Bush's envoy to Sudan, I got a call from the Brazilian ambassador, who later became the foreign minister, that he wanted to see me. And I said, I'm the envoy, so of course I'll do what was ever best for President Bush. And I went, and I said, why do you care what happens in Sudan? He said, well, my foreign minister told me to contact you to have a conversation because he's been reading your statements at the UN and in Sudan. He agrees with your approach. The more radical elements wanted us to basically go to war with Sudan, and you've been trying to restrain them. And I said, we don't need another war. So we had these long conversations, and I was intrigued. I brought up the issue of why President Lula was supporting, this was 17 years ago, why President Lula was supportive of Chavez in a functioning democracy that's erect now. I mean, economically erect, politically erect. And he went into a tirade about the Venezuelan elites all being criminals. I mean, I said, well, do you mean a few criminals? He said, no, the entire middle class and upper class in Venezuela are all criminal. And he went on and on and on. And I finally said, let's go back to Sudan. But I didn't understand. I mean, he sounded like a Marxist to me. Yeah. Is that Lula's party? Why did he talk that way?
I mean, and he had an individual, Marco Aurelio Garcia, who was the foreign policy advisor, who, when I got there, Venezuela was an issue for us. And so I raised it with him. And he said, no, you don't understand. The situation's very well. Things are going well there. And I said, how can you say that? And I said, what are you reading? He says, no, you don't know. You don't know what's really going on. I go there every week, every other week or something like that. He's since passed away, but he was very instrumental in shaping that. It'll be interesting to see what he does now. I think I haven't seen much. He's sort of walking that finally, because it's not doing well.
Oh, it's a wreck.
and together with Nicaragua.
25% of the country's Venezuelans have left. Yeah, I think there are 3 or 4 million in Colombia alone.
Right, right, 7 million altogether.
When 25% of any country leaves, something's
There's a problem.
wrong.
Something's wrong.
Right.
Exactly. And the economy tanking. So I had to think that maybe obviously there's ideology in it, in Cuban involvement, and sort of a meeting of the minds, and there is an agenda there.
Sure.
But the situation now, I'm waiting to see how can he say that this works? It's a disaster.
Yeah, it is a disaster. It is a disaster. So would you talk a little bit about, why don't you give me the cards, Hayden? Thank you. Would you talk a little bit about this, the alternate crop program in Bolivia, which I was fascinated by. I got into a little political trouble, alternative development. And I'll tell you the story. It's because of Bolivia, when I was with you, I was telling my class in development today that you and I went with the American ambassador to a village in the Aymara-speaking people in the lowlands, which was where Morales was from, actually. And we went, and the ambassador spoke the indigenous language, not Spanish, to the village, which 60% of Bolivia are entirely indigenous, Indian ethnic group. Two of them. Quechuan is the Inca.
Quechua and Aymara.
Right, and Quechua are the ancient Inca civilization, the modern. But the villagers were absolutely shocked that an American ambassador could speak their local language, which I thought was fascinating.
Ambassador Greenlee.
Right, and he had been a Peace Corps worker there many years before. But what I want to raise is this. My memory is, I think it was either 1,300 or maybe it was 2,200 kilometers or miles of stone-paved roads that we put in place, and you were one of the people that orchestrated all that, in order to create an export economy of bananas, papaya, and mango, wasn't it? Pineapples to Sao Paulo and to Buenos Aires, wasn't it? They were the primary markets. Yes. And this was designed as an alternate to producing coca for cocaine. And my memory is, from your lecture to me, was that we went from $30 million in exports of those fruits to $128 million over 10 years or something like that. Would you talk a little bit about the program?
Yeah, your memory is better than mine. But yeah, so the Alternative Development Program, it's like a integrated development. So it had the trying to revamp the economy locally, which depended on coca for cocaine. And so what we were working with the Bolivian authorities was to replace that illegal economy with legal crops. And so you needed to test what worked, what had markets, and what did you need for the market. You needed to train. That's where USAID came in, providing some of that technical support. And a lot of times it was the logistics, connecting it, the roads, the tertiary roads, which is critical. You forget about that. You can find the markets, but if you can't get the bananas out without bruising them, then you don't succeed. So the program, had all sorts of different parts with technical assistance and marketing and training the farmers and packaging in better agriculture practices, in supporting the families. It all seemed to be working, right?
Yes.
Even though in the case of Bolivia, there is a law that allows for a certain number of hectares or acres for legal coca production for ceremonial purposes. But what we all knew is that the production of the coca leaves was far beyond the legal level, and that excess was being used for illegal purposes. So it's working with the farmers, organizing them, and they worked on associations so they could help with themselves with credit and make it sustainable. So it really was a lot of effort with a lot of expertise on these tropical crops and regional markets
domestic and regional markets that could survive and actually they could make a living, that could in some way compete. You could never compete with a legal drug, but that could somehow give these families a legal crop, as well as they wouldn't have to worry about doing something illegal and being worried about their own security and bringing all the narco criminal groups in the region. So this seemed to be working, but of course, for political reasons, Evo was a cocalero. He supported the production of coca beyond the legal levels. That became an issue, very anti-American, and so in the long run,
Very close to Cuba.
Very close to Cuba, and unfortunately, over the years, it became very difficult to continue, and I believe in 2014, maybe, we had to close the
Actually, I recall getting a cable, I think you had left, from the field saying there's a mob wanting to blow up the mission, and they had to call the police in to stop them. And it was Morales' people.
It was all manipulated, and the farmers wanted the help.
Yes.
They appreciated the know-how, the expertise, the assistance in the warehouses and so forth. So these are things that they never had, they never would have. But
now I got into trouble because I took the Bolivian engineer who built these. These are like Roman roads. They're using field stones, and they put them in, just like the ancient Romans did, into this road you could drive 45 miles an hour without damaging your car over hundreds of miles. And I send them to Afghanistan.
Yes.
And Karzai said, no, I don't want these. I want paved roads. I said, these cost 10% of the paved roads, and they last longer. Well, the Roman roads, some of them are still in use after 2,500 years, 2,300 years. And he wouldn't hear of it. And I tried to build them, and then the media got onto it. It was a big mess.
Yeah, the technology was one with it. With it rained, it had a way of letting it just kind of go without destroying the
exactly.
The pavement.
So what, I'm going to go through the questions now. What is a characteristic or skill that you learned that that you would attribute to your successful career in the Foreign Service?
A skill.
A skill.
Listening.
Listening.
I think it sounds obvious, but we assume we know the answers, and sometimes people get to a country and they just know the answers, but that's not always the case, so you have to listen. And at the end of the day, it's that negotiation back and forth. And I think it's a skill that sometimes I saw people just assuming that they knew the answer, and we come across as being arrogant, and then it stops any ability of really having a dialogue, and you lose it right there.
They say the best listener of any president since World War II was George H.W. Bush. That was one of his great skills, is listening. What do you see as Brazil's role in the future in the BRICS? BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, and China. Now, Russia is a little problematic in the list. And then the S would be South Africa, right?
South Africa.
South Africa is not doing too well right now either. But
I think that whole grouping,
formulation doesn't work
the
anymore.
whole grouping is a little bit, I'd be skeptical. And I've been trying to see, what are they going to do? It's interesting that the BRICS has a bank, a development bank, that is supposed to be funding different development programs. And it appears that Lula is going to name the former president Dilma as the head of that bank, which is not saying very much since there were so many issues with the fiscal management under her term. But I don't know, except to say that Lula is a strong believer in these regional entities, and a lot of them have been dormant. and
They announce them and then nothing happens.
and nothing happens. And so it was interesting, about 2 weeks ago, Argentina, seeing that Lula had come back, and Fernandez said, okay, let's revamp the CELAC, which is the community of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, of which the United States is not a member. And so it was done in a way of like, okay, you have the OAS, but we don't want the United States a member in this one. So Argentina calls the meeting and invites President Biden, which is unusual, but maybe just, I don't know, to test us out. The president obviously doesn't go, but sends the special envoy for the Americas, former Senator Christopher Dodd.
Oh, yes.
Very quiet in the background. And they all proceed, you had, Maduro was going to go. Last minute, he got scared that he may get apprehended because there's a warrant out for his arrest and a lot of money behind it. So he canceled his trip. But eventually people went, and it was interesting because the Uruguayan president then said, well, wait a minute. We're here signing things that were all democratic. There's some countries in the region that aren't democratic. So
really?
The friction started. But at the end of the day, they signed this very long declaration. They had the pictures. They talked about establishing a regional coin. And is anything going to happen? Nothing's going to happen. So part of me says, okay, a lot of this is rhetoric, and you have the symbolism. Mm-hmm. I think in the case of the left, they do care about the symbolism. Mm-hmm. And so that's important. But at the end of the day, who will finance this stuff? There's no money like there was before.
Right.
The SELEC, I think, is dead.
And this notion of a currency union
of the currency.
That's kind of ridiculous. But they don't like the dollar being the currency of the Americas.
That's part of it.
Yes. So second question here. From your service in Latin America, why do so many Western Hemisphere countries seem to experience such high levels of violence and homicides compared to other developed parts of the world, even developing countries? Very high. In fact, I went to a meeting, it was a mid-level staff meeting, and I was the aid admin. I walked in and they said, why are you here? I said, because this is a huge problem and I want to just show you that I really care about this. It was an OAU meeting on murder rates as a public health issue.
Yes.
It's so high. Could you explain that a little bit?
Oh, I wish I had the answer. But yes, I mean, you have Colombia that had very high rates of assassinations. It went down during the peace process, and I think it has not gone back to as high as it was. But still, you have a very large number of human rights activists being killed. You've got, the killings of journalists in the region, certainly Mexico, and Salvador. I mean, we were talking about the situation there where the violence has come down, but the cost of that is, a very cramping down on human rights. And so, I don't know what it is, but it is very prevalent, and unfortunately, it's arms are very much available, and the illegal business fuels a lot of this.
A lot of this is drug related.
A lot of it is drug related, yes. But and today it's become more complicated because it's not only drug related.
Right.
Today it's also illegal drugs. I'm sorry. Illegal mining,
right.
Illegal logging, there's even illegal fishing, and that it attracts the illegal groups, which bring in the arms, which generate the kidnappings and so forth, and that's why I think it's the security aspects that we need to tackle, and by sharing information. To be able to try to get a handle on what is not only a regional issue, but a global issue, because there are tentacles everywhere. And there are no principles under which these people abide. So
you can't negotiate with a bunch of criminal gangs. Right. So what advice do you have for young women trying to enter the Foreign Service? How did you balance your personal and professional life?
So I think the Foreign Service is not for everyone because it does entail moving around and being able to deal with adaptability very easily. So meaning that if you're a person that likes to have clarity on where you're going to be in 2 years, where you're going to be in 3 years, the Foreign Service is probably not where you want to go. Because, I mean, for instance, I was in Guatemala. It was finalizing my term there and packed everything because I was going to a regional office in Barbados. I wanted to change to the Caribbean and had been recruited there by Aaron Williams. Oh. And then I got a phone call. I said, no, you're not going there. You're going to Nicaragua. That's our priority. This was right after Doña Violeta Chamorro had been elected, and we had a lot of attention there, a lot of money, and so I had to move there. And
this is not the Sandinistas. This Chamorro was a genuine Democrat and a reformer, and we were. Yes. This was in the 80s, wasn't it?
No, it was 1990.
1990. Okay.
May 1990, and I arrived in June 1990. And in fact, her daughter was just one of the people that was released.
Oh, is that right?
The 222 people that were imprisoned by Ortega. And a lot of the people that AID worked with were in jail and are now, 222 of them are out. But the point is that, you know, if you are someone that really needs to know exactly where you're going to be and you want to have everything mapped out, it's not where you want to be, because the Foreign Service, you know, they need you here, you're there, and then you arrive to a new place, you have to meet new friends, you have to understand the challenges, the priorities, develop contacts, you know, who do you negotiate, read the country. You have to be motivated by that, and I enjoyed that. But I recognize that not everybody enjoys it, and for females, you know, some countries are harder. I started off my career. My first post was in Bangladesh, and I had to do certain things differently, like not travel by myself, travel with my colleague who was supposedly my brother, but in order to be able to go out, because it was not well seen to be, you know, a single woman traveling around. It gets a little bit more complicated when you have a family, a partner, and so forth, and children, of course, because then you have to juggle schools and so forth. But it can be done. You know, it can be done with, you know, negotiation back and forth with your spouse, and I think that the rewarding part of it is just so. It's much more than the difficulty of trying to work these things out. But before you got into it, you really need to know that that's the kind of thing you like. And sometimes it's tough. It's not always easy. Yeah, you know, there are sacrifices.
And sometimes you go to a country where it's in political upheaval, and then you have to leave and be.
And it can be dangerous.
Yes, it can be dangerous.
You're exposed.
What do you think would be the future of Paraguay-U.S. relations if the ruling party candidate wins, given the sanctions against the former president?
Oh, there's a Paraguayan in the room? Yeah, I seldom get Paraguay questions, but yes, so this is an interesting one. Yeah, so Santiago Peña, who is the candidate of the Colorado Party, and the person that they're referring to there is Horacio Cartes, who's the corrupt, who's now been listed by us and called, you know, put all on this list, and everyone knows he's corrupt. And Santiago Peña is sort of his candidate. It's his party's candidate. If he gets elected, I think the United States will work with who's elected. I don't think there's anything, at least publicly, against Santiago. It's unfortunate that that somebody with the profile as Santiago, because he's a well-recognized economist, was at the IMF and was at the central bank, that he would align himself with somebody like Horacio Cartes. But, that's what he did.
Right.
But if elected, I think that we would, I can't speak on behalf of the U.S. government anymore, but I would think that we would look and see what it is that he wants to do, and hopefully he doesn't go off and do, corrupt things, and so we would work with who's elected.
Yep. What motivated your transition from public health to democracy and governance initiative? That's a good question.
So interestingly enough, in my career, and I've only had a chance to think back on it now, you get comfortable with what you know. And I was a health specialist, and I was very comfortable doing that. And my supervisor at the time said, you're a great manager. We have a huge portfolio now, and at the time, the democracy building, institution strengthening was starting off, and people weren't trained for it. And it says, we'd like you to manage this portfolio. And I said, I don't know anything about it. And so I think it was more because I manage. And then I realized that I don't need to be an expert on administration of justice. I need to surround myself by people who really know their job. And so it's a team effort. And I realized that, even though I loved public health, and that was what I was trained to do, that I also saw the need to strengthen democracies and democratic institutions. And if I could help by bringing the people who could help with this, it was a matter of surrounding myself with those experts and having a team approach to things, and not being, it's not only me, it's having those people that really shine and can carry the water. So it was a hard transition, because actually more than health to democracy, it was from health to management, to executive management.
And I have to just say, I said this at a hearing. Senator Biden actually was at the hearing, obviously President Biden now, but this is when I was confirmed for the head of AID in 2001. And he said to me, should AID be merged into the State Department? I said, absolutely not, and I will not support it. And he said, why? I said, because AID is more like the Defense Department than it is the State Department. He said, what? And I said, forget the guns, okay? You get promoted in state because you're a good diplomat. You understand political relations. You understand the nuances of words. You understand symbols, and you can deliver demarches. And it's a matter of communication. It's like a chessboard. That's what diplomacy is, it's a chessboard. The Defense Department and AID have programs. They do assessments and evaluations. They design programs. They call it op plans in the Defense Department. We call it the program officer's function is very similar to the operations officer in the Pentagon. I've made these parallels. People are a little shocked when I say it, but you get promoted in state and in AID and defense for being a good manager. But the State Department doesn't really manage programs. No. They have some, but they manage policy, which is different.
It is.
And so the people who get promoted in AID and DOD are people who can manage large, complex undertakings with a lot of moving parts, a lot of people, large budgets, and large contracts and grants.
All coming at you at the same time.
All coming at you at the same time. So what classes, if you were to give advice to someone, and I can see there's students here interested in this, what classes, if you wanted to go into the Foreign Service, what classes and majors and training would be useful? And it just says, what advice do you particularly have for women? I think it's the same skills.
Yeah, I don't think it makes any difference whether you're a female or a male. It's the same skills. Well, I would encourage everyone to take a language, any language, because I think having a language skill makes you think of things differently. And having that skill is important. Together with communication skills and negotiations, it's all part of the listening skill and being able to thread, different solutions. So I would say that those are important things to have. Negotiations. I don't know if you have negotiation courses, but that's you'd be surprised at how people want it their way, and sometimes it's a give and take, and the process is so important. We all know where we want to get to, and we all agree about where we want to get to, but sometimes the problems happen in the process leading up to that end game. And so how to get there in a way that's a give and take, those negotiation skills are important.
Will the U.S. support Brazil's membership in the OECD? The OECD was an organization created at the end of the Marshall Plan in the early 60s to coordinate among the advanced industrial democracies recovering from World War II. And it's in Paris, the headquarters. We helped create it. And it's now 34 or 35, maybe even more countries. Yeah. Many middle-income countries now have their own aid programs. South Korea, that we had a huge aid program, is. A lot of what South Korea is in fact what AID did there in the 60s and 70s. But they're a member, and they have their own aid program now. And Turkey has one, too. I don't know why Turkey does, but Brazil has an aid program, right?
Right. But they're not a member of OECD.
Should they?
Well, when I was there, they were working on it, and they were moving forward on this. It's like a report card of different requirements, including, corruption, ways of addressing corruption issues, and environmental concerns, and it's just a very long list of requirements. And they were, working on them. Whether the U.S. supports Brazil on this, it's a political decision, and the United States will support a certain number at one time. So it's like if 5 countries are on the list, it becomes a political decision as to how many, which one, and depending on other issues that may be happening
when
at the time.
I was aid administrator, we also had associate members that were not full members.
Right.
And they could observe and all that, but not be full members.
And who knows, maybe Brazil is already an associate member to sort of observe, but they're not yet the member.
Can you say something, this is an interesting question, about Mrs. Bolsonaro's influence on her husband and the government? Did she play a major role?
I think so. I think it was, she's an evangelical, and she pulled in that kind of part into the agenda. And at times controversial, she would have, an evangelical event at the palace, and that would generate all sorts of controversy. So I have to say that because of that, she's charismatic, so she did play a role in strengthening it. I mean, and she was named a lot, Michelle and that. So I'm sure she played a role.
Interesting. What are your thoughts on the parallels between the incidents in the United States on January 6th and the incidents in Brazil? You talked about that a little bit. Are there a lot of other parallels? There is I read some comments of Lula, who said that the military did not intervene. But no, those accusations were made in the United States. The U.S. military is not supposed to intervene in domestic. That's the purpose of the National Guard. The problem is there is no National Guard, technically, for Washington, D.C., and they were talking about asking the Virginia National Guard and the Maryland National Guard. There are complex issues. And at one point, I guess, without the approval of the White House, the Joint Chiefs of Staff said, we're not putting up with this, and they were going to intervene, but there are also legal issues. What about the accusation that the Brazilian military was unsympathetic to Lula and was just watching it all happen and doing nothing?
So I have no doubt that there may be a section or a corps or, players within the military that are supportive of Bolsonaro and his agenda. Just, because there are individuals, the armed forces are huge. But as an institution, I do not believe that. And I got this question a lot because in Southcom, I did work with the Brazilian military, armed forces, and it's a strong institution. And every time I asked, and they said, we're apolitical. But the problem was that it became difficult to decipher because Bolsonaro had a lot of former military in the government.
Yep.
And some would say, we're here because we want to make sure it's done the right way and it's our responsibility. So at the end of the day, on January 8th, there was a lot of people were saying, oh, the military is going to support it. But they didn't.
Right.
So I think they are institutionally strong.
Okay.
And I think, are there others that aren't? Yes, they're probably there, but it didn't succeed.
Okay. So President, I didn't know this. The President Trump initiated a military alliance of some kind with Brazil, NATO-like. Did they make some announcement of conversations on this or negotiations?
Yes, as the non-NATO major ally, yes. It's a special category of the relationship. And then several countries, Colombia is another one who has it. And
has it remained under President Biden?
Yes, because this was congressionally mandated. It's very prestigious, and it provides certain privileges that other countries wouldn't have. But it was not only something the president did. There's a lot of homework that was done into making this happen.
Okay, how late are we, Monica? Okay, we got a couple more minutes. What do you predict how relevant will Brazil be to the United States and its foreign policy in the next 10 to 20 years? I mean, any country the size of Brazil with the size economy has to be important to the United States.
Yes, we've got more than 100 companies, U.S. companies, very engaged in Brazil, and some of them over 50, 60, 80, 90 years, and I can't see that importance changing, certainly economically. Again, as I mentioned, the purchasing power. On the environment, I mean, if we're talking about the Amazons, having Brazil front and center engage in a leadership role on environmental issues is important, and so that will continue to be the case. But food security, I think, it's going to become
Didn't AID
more
have a
more
lot
of
to
an
do
issue.
with helping build the Brazilian economy in the 60s,
Yes.
agricultural economy?
The Ag Research in Barapa, the Ag Research Institute, which is a premier institution today, had a lot of technical support, expertise from the United States. But today, I mean, we could be doing a lot if we're not already. I'm sure we are in some certain areas doing a lot together. But look at health. I think, putting aside what happened during COVID, but they have a lot of capacity and public health institutions that do a lot of research on not only vaccines, but other kind of health tools and that we could be doing together. So I see that the agenda is there to just space, you name it, education. There's a lot there. It just depends on how much Brazil wants to engage in and how much we are ready to.
Brazilians produce a plane. I've been on them. They're used in the United States. They're used in
Embraer.
executive jet. Exactly. this is, I think, will be the last question. How will President Lula's conviction for corruption when he was in office affect his executive performance? And the second question is, what will his actions be to protect the Amazon? What specific things will he be able to do that are different?
Well, he has started trying to reestablish some of the institutionality, the institutional framework that help protect the Amazons or the indigenous. You know, there are communities that live in the Amazon, and they need to figure out, or they need to do it, they need to live in a sustainable way. And so there is expertise that can be provided to them so that the Amazon is protected, but at the same time, we recognize that these indigenous communities need their livelihood.
Sure.
So there are ways that this can be done. And so I think there'll be a focus on that. There'll be the whole deforestation issue is something that will...
How much deforestation took place under Bolsonaro? Because he opened it up for development, right?
Right. You know, it depends if you asked. You know, I had this conversation with the former ambassador, and he said, no, we're doing a lot on deforestation, and, you know, it's
This
just
is
not
under
getting
Bolsonaro?
under Bolsonaro. So, I mean, I don't know what the truth is, but, you know, it's, I think the experts, I mean, this is something that can be looked at from,
Sure, from a satellite.
from above.
Yeah,
So I don't have the exact figures. But
Tell me about his, just final question, tell me about his conviction. Was it highly politicized, or was he engaged in some corrupt practices?
So, you know, I don't have any insights to know whether he himself stole the money. I mean, what I find strange is that he was convicted on the refurbishing of an apartment, you know, something small in what it could have been, right?
Yep.
And so, you know, why wasn't his conviction based on something even larger if he was as corrupt as they say he was? So, I don't know. I mean, I just don't have the insights to know exactly.
What happened?
But yes, there was a lot, and some say it was politically instigated. But there was a lot of corruption going on. And, you know, the Odebrecht case is a clear example of what was going on. And that was huge. And it's touched on
Other countries all over.
All over the place.
Right. The thing that was astonishing to me is how independent the prosecutors were. They went after everybody. They were cleaning everything out. And I was saying, in a weak democracy, you would not have prosecutors that independent, that they would be going after political leaders the way they were.
Yeah, well, there's always that judicial overreach, right? That
yes.
can happen.
That's true. That's true. Well, thank you for coming, Liliana. Thank you for your questions. And
some good questions, very good questions.
Our event this evening is at an end. Thank you.
Thank you.